Wow, this is a big one. It's the first in a series that I'm going to do that is on a subject very personal to me, and I know hundreds and thousands of other people in sport and out of sport where brain injuries, breathing, and concussions are all linked, and looking at the research that there is out there now and has been there for, as we'll see, many decades. And what I want to try and do is help us all, those that have been impacted, those that are working with people, those that are trying to provide solutions for helping our brains recover, as well as protocols and solutions to help rehabilitate and know when is it safe, when is the brain in a state able to go back into some sort of scenario that it may get injured again in, whether that be a contact sport like I played in rugby. I'll give you a few headlines of things we're going to look at within this is part one of the series on breathing and concussions and brain injuries. And the first headline is going to be that being symptom free for 7 days, the research is showing us, is not adequate assessment of how well the brain is recovered or has recovered. 7 days symptom free is a false sentiment of or state of whether the brain has actually recovered or not. So we'll dive in to a little bit of that. We'll look at quite an alarming piece of research done just this year in 2023 that shows just 3 concussions can have significant long-term cognitive effects. That's not 3 in a row like short space time, just 3 in a lifetime. And those that have played contact sports, rugby and other contact sports like myself will know that that 3 can be a very, very easy number to reach. And you know, 3 is such a low number that even whether you play contact sports or not, you may have banged your head 3 times just in the kitchen, for example. So this is it's quite alarming, but this is the type of thing that we need to be aware of because it's out there in the literature and it helps us to inform what we're going to do to keep ourselves in the best possible brain health. And then we're also going to go back right at the beginning, after this little intro, to right back to where the earliest bits of research that I found is in the 1960s. So we're going back 60 years, where they were understanding how brain injuries and concussions were affecting our breathing and therefore our cerebral blood flow. So as I say, I've got a personal story and personal relationship which I'll share a little bit of in this podcast later. I want to help us all understand this information that is out there now, so that we can provide solutions for those of us that are working in this area, working either with people that are suffering brain injuries, concussions, whether you've had one yourself, or whether someone, a family member or a loved one, is going through that or may go through that in the future. There is so much research out there. There is so much good information, and we're trying to make it easy, and we'll be making it easy through this series to understand what are some of the simple things that we can do with our breathing that will help our brain health. What are simple things that we can do with our breathing and heart rate variability that helps us make a better assessment of the brain. And I've also had myself 10 years on from my brain injury, results from a follow-up scan, which I'll share in part 2. So this was really just to whet your appetite a little bit of what's in store. We're going to go on a bit of a journey. I may get a bit emotional because it is, it's something that is very important to me and a lot of people that I work with and that I love and I care about. And I hope that it's going to be informative for you too. We enter this world taking our first breath, and sadly, we leave this place taking our last. And what I want to do with this podcast is to explore what happens between those breaths. I'm David Jackson, Jacko, and this is the Between Breaths podcast. So before we delve deep into part 1 of this series on how breathing and concussions and brain injuries are related. Some of you will notice, you'll be like, hold on, you're wearing that nice jacket, Jacko, but that doesn't look like the camper van. If you're watching on Spotify video, if you're watching on YouTube, yes, the camper van is in for some repairs, let's say, and yes, the podcast studio is she's sleeping. She'll be back. And then others of you that are also very attentive and like to consume the podcast via the probreathwork.com website, which is my website, will see that the podcast has a sponsor. The purpose of this podcast is to, give as best quality information that we can. I've committed not to be doing one every single Monday, even though I try to put them out on Mondays. My commitment is to putting high quality information out there. It isn't to try and make money off of the podcast. That is not the purpose of the podcast. It's to put information out there, have a platform for me to be able to share the things that I'm learning that I think will be helpful for people, and to get guests on to broaden out our understanding of breath work, of breath training, and how breathing can be such a powerful tool as well as a solution in many situations. And I think that one of the things that I found most challenging during the initial part of my brain injury was that I wasn't given anything or anything that I could do. I wasn't given any breathing exercises that I could do, which I would now know. The other thing that is some really interesting research showing in the acute phase of injuries is the use of supplementary ketones. So not having to be in ketosis to try and reduce brain inflammation, but using ketones as a fuel source and a clean fuel source. During an acute phase of a brain injury, the cerebral blood flow is reduced. We'll talk about this during the podcast, but the oxygen delivery to the brain and glucose supply to the brain is reduced. Whereas a product that I've been using, and these guys, Ketone IQ is by HVMN, and they very kindly, I've spoken to the guy that's headed up all the research for this. They come in this, the bigger bottle as well as the little shots. I was happy to partner with them because I've been using them myself. It's something that there's research to show that it is very useful during the acute phase of a brain injury. I've been using it even though I'm 10 years on for seeing improvements in my sleep, seeing improvements in my energy levels during the day, increasing focus and reducing brain fog. And so I was very happy to have them as a sponsor on the podcast because it fits in with what I believe in, it fits in with what I'm doing, and you can get 20% discount off the products. And so you can give them a try, you can enjoy some of the benefits, improving sleep, improvements in cognition. I'm also using them as part of my endurance training as well. I'll share more a little bit about that as I get back into a little bit more of my ultra running. I've got an event coming up at the beginning of April, and you can get 20% off. Thank you to HVMN, the podcast sponsors. So if you use the code JACKO at hvmn.com, then you will get 20% off your first order, and you can use the link will be in the show notes. And if you actually use the link hvmn.com/Jacko, then it will automatically give you that 20% off, or you can just put the code in. Totally up to you. So the link is in the show notes. Head over to hvmn.com once you've listened to the podcast. So let's start at the beginning then in terms of the research that I've been looking at, and just in terms of chronological, can't say that, can I? I'm not an English teacher. This is science. In chronological order. So there may be stuff that dates back earlier, but what I've seen is from the 1960s. There's one from 1963, I believe, and then Frohman from 1968. From the British Journal of Anaesthesia, reported that after a brain injury or concussion, we see an increase in minute ventilation, so the total amount of air that someone's breathing, so an inefficiency of breathing, likely coming from an increased respiratory rate and or increase in tidal volume, so the size of each breath. And with that, as we would expect, a reduction in arterial CO2, carbon dioxide levels. This was then backed up by a study done in 2017 from Churchill that said that after a brain injury or concussion, there is a disruption to brain function, particularly around the respiratory centre, which showed an increase in respiratory rate, altered breathing mechanics, as well as a reduction in end tidal CO2. So less CO2 in the air that we're breathing out, meaning that we've not kept as much carbon dioxide inside of us, therefore we've become more sensitive to carbon dioxide. So the same as that study from 1968. And what's quite sort of alarming and frightening to me is that this is 60 years old, yet do we assess breathing when we have had a brain injury or a concussion? Do we help someone restore their respiratory rate, their sensitivity to carbon dioxide? It's just not even on the map, even though it's been out there for so long. As to why we aren't doing that, who knows? What's important is trying to put information out there like this, gathering it together so that people can take notice and people can understand. So we don't assess breathing. I never had my breathing assessed once through all of the number of concussions and brain injuries I had. What we do though assess is symptoms. But as I mentioned at the start, assessing symptoms is now being shown as being not reflective of or representative of has the brain actually recovered or not. All it's saying is your symptoms have calmed down. There's some really interesting research in the literature now. One done by Wang in 2016 from the Journal of Neurotrauma showed that someone that's symptom-free after 7 days, they then scan them on day 8, and even though they're symptom-free on day 7, the next day on day 8, typically in rugby, that would mean you could go and play a game of rugby because you're symptom-free. They scan their brain and their brain is still showing signs of a brain injury, of trauma from their injury or concussion. And then alarming still, so you're like day 8, okay, well it's 1 day different. But the alarming thing is 7 months later, within that study, 7 months later, they scanned them again and they were still showing signs of brain injury. I know I'm 10 years on and I've got my scan results that I'll share with you in part 2. But this issue around brain injuries and recovery and only tracking and assessing symptoms is clearly shown and understood now in the literature that it is not fit for purpose. And when someone is symptom free and feeling better, that is great, but are we assessing their breathing? We'll come on to talk about are we assessing their HRV, because we can't give someone a functional MRI scan every time we want to check whether they've recovered or not. But there are things we're going to go into during this podcast that show that there are other signals that the body is able to give us through our breathing and our heart rate variability that will give us an indication far better than just checking on their symptoms. Now, you'll hear me getting quite sort of probably passionate within this podcast, so apologies if the tone or the volume goes up a little bit at times, but yeah, my personal story is back in 2013, and I've shared a little bit about this in the origin story, but the context I'll just give the context for what my sort of advice was like post my injury. So 2013, sustained a traumatic brain injury. It got classified as a concussion on a CT scan initially, and I got sent home. And I was back in hospital a number of times for the next few weeks and months because I just wasn't getting better. My symptoms weren't improving, and I knew that typically, okay, sometimes it was taking me a little bit longer to get over brain injuries or concussions over a 13-year career, but there was something different about this one. I'd had a seizure on the training field that I'd never had a seizure before, that this brain injury brought on. Fast forward about 5 months, I finally get an MRI scan, and it shows that there's a scar from a bleed that I would have had that would have been a result of or part of that seizure from the impact. Now, it wasn't that I had a big impact, it was that my brain had become more susceptible to being injured. This was a cumulative build-up over, I had my first concussion when I was 16, and a cumulative build-up that I was completely unaware of at the time. I saw the neurologist when I had my results for my MRI scan. I didn't get to see them at the beginning, and they immediately looked at my history of brain injuries because I'd been taken to hospital a number of times, and they literally said, you've been busy. And they seemed surprised that I didn't know of this cumulative build-up. That was something I wasn't aware of, but the neurologist there was aware of, which was very helpful for me. It made a lot of sense in terms of why it was easier for me to get knocked out why I seemed to be more susceptible to getting knocked out and getting concussed now, and it was taking less to knock me out, and also my recovery time to become symptom free, which remember doesn't mean my brain has recovered, but to get symptom free was taking longer. What I know now is that even though when I did become symptom free, obviously my brain was still in an injured state, and hence why it didn't take as much next time to knock me out, even though there could have been 6 months in between the next concussion, because we know that this, from the literature that we're looking at, we know that this injury of the brain and how long the brain will take to recover is going to take a lot longer than what those symptoms are. It can be 6 months, it can be years potentially, depending on the severity and depending on what we're doing afterwards. The neurologist specialist she was a lovely lady. She basically knew, she was telling me I had to retire from my job and the sport that I loved, so she was she was almost worried about the way she said it. But the interesting thing, or one interesting thing was this, well, two interesting things. One, she didn't assess my breathing and didn't give me any breathing exercises or anything to do to help with restoring cerebral blood flow. I'll go into that through this series. But what she did say was, if a boxer, professional boxer, couldn't take a standing 10 count in a professional fight, they would have to, so they've been knocked down and they couldn't get back up within 10 seconds. Not that they blacked out, but just that that's basically a sign that they're probably concussed. And if they can't take a standing 10 count, they have to go and have an MRI scan like I'd had. If anything comes up on their scan, like mine, where there was some sort of scarring or some sort of bleeding, then they weren't allowed to box again professionally. They'd have their license taken off them. She said, in rugby, there are no rules. So the choice is actually yours. But I was like, I understand enough. I'm actually scared of going back on the field, to be honest. And yeah, this isn't even a decision for me. At that point, we may not have known about cumulative build-up, but we knew about second impact syndrome. And yeah, it was something that I was afraid for my own safety, to be honest, at that point. So I was very relieved that she had that advice for me, that ultimately it was still a decision, but it didn't feel like there was any decision to be made. So I was actually very grateful for that. It's huge relief. I think that's when my recovery probably actually started, because I was no longer trying to get back to playing rugby, and I could actually move on with my recovery and my life. I mentioned a couple of things there around like not having my breathing assessed. So I had no idea. She had no idea that my breathing was, the neurologist had no idea I don't know whether presumably she didn't know, hence why she didn't assess my breathing. And I had no idea until I came across the oxygen advantage and did my Bolt score for the first time, assessed my respiratory rate for the first time, like literally probably 4 years on after this. So I was going around for quite some time with no idea that my breathings had been altered, even though the literature shows us 60 years ago someone was telling us this. So yeah, unfortunately, I wasn't aware of that. And one of the things I hope is that just one person listens to this and they're able to understand what's going on with their breathing post concussion. They can help assess themselves better, and they can also give themselves some tools, because what I found was there's a lot of things going on in your mental state when you're suffering with concussion. Post-concussion syndrome can go on for quite a long time, and some of the symptoms are depression. If you think that you're not playing the sport you love, you might have to retire from the sport that you love. Your job is at stake, and how are you going to provide for your family? All those things are also going around your head. And being told that there's nothing you can do, go home, just try not to stimulate your brain at all, because it just needs no stimulation to allow it to recover. That was the advice I was given. Now, we know that that's not true in terms of with things that we can do to improve cerebral blood flow. And I'm going to go through those things for simple breathing exercises. The other thing is, going home and doing nothing is fairly depressing on its own as well. There is no real hope. The advice was do nothing. We hope that you'll make a full recovery. We'll have to see. If I'd have had something to do, just one breathing exercise, I'd have done that. Like, I just needed something. It would have been so much of a more put me in a more positive mental state and attitude to feel like I was doing something. Like with the ketones, for example, taking the ketone supplements and to at least know I'm providing my brain with a clean source of fuel, despite the fact that it's getting less blood flow and oxygen and glucose because of the injury. But I can help in that acute phase, taking something like ketone IQ from HVMN. So yeah, I think it's that side of it. Don't underestimate how mentally effective having something and feeling like you're doing something, feeling like you're being productive, rather than just crossing your fingers, praying and hoping, even though we do those things as well. I also mentioned about the cumulative build-up, and one alarming piece of evidence in the literature just this year, 2013, from Journal of Neurotrauma. So it's 2023, and Lennon, I believe, was the author, showing that after just 3 concussions, which is worrying, just 3 concussions, not 3 immediately together, but just 3 in a lifetime, in a period of time, significantly impacts cognitive function long term. I mean, I had more than 10. And remember, concussion doesn't mean out cold. It's just more of that evidence to show us that we aren't in a state when we're symptom free to go back and take part in potentially getting your head banged again. And even if you are fully recovered, if you have 3, cognitive decline after that is significantly impaired. And I think there's just some alarming things to be aware of, and this is the things that I wish I was aware of, and why it's so important that when we are going back into contact sports, that we're doing so well informed about the health and well-being and recovery of your brain, so that you're not putting yourself in a situation like I got into. So what is the big issue with the concussion, with the brain injury? What's driving this? And the biggest thing that we're trying to restore, because we know it's the biggest thing that gets impact, is cerebral blood flow. So that is the blood being able to get to your brain and deliver oxygen. Your brain only is about 2% of the mass of your whole body, but it takes up about 20% of your oxygen consumption. If your cerebral blood flow is impaired slightly, then the oxygen delivery and other glucose as a fuel source is going to be impacted. And it's not something that's going to just normalize itself because of how cerebral blood flow is linked to our breathing. We know that breathing influences circulation. Carbon dioxide in particular influences circulation. Carbon dioxide also influences oxygen being released from our blood cells into tissues. If my brain injury has affected my respiratory center, so the research shows us, I'm breathing faster, that respiratory rate has changed, my mechanics have become poorer, I've become more inefficient, more upper chest breathing, potentially mouth breathing as well as part of that. And then my CO2 sensitivity starts to increase. I become more sensitive, less tolerable of carbon dioxide. So I have less carbon dioxide in the body. My cerebral blood flow is reduced. My general circulation all around my body is going to be reduced, and oxygen is going to be more tightly bound within the blood. So we then get into this little cascade of the injury is affecting cerebral blood flow. I need to increase cerebral blood flow, but the injury is affecting my breathing, which is also negatively affecting my cerebral blood flow and oxygen delivery to all of my tissues, and particularly into the brain. And one interesting thing about all of the symptoms associated with, well, not all, but a lot of the symptoms associated with concussions and post-concussive syndrome are, things that breathing could be a part of. So, an inability to be able to focus and concentrate, brain fog, poor sleep, not being able to tolerate exercise. If I'm really bad at breathing, anxiety, depression, these things can be linked to carbon dioxide sensitivity. And we know from the literature our breathing's getting affected, and these long-term symptoms may be a result of the brain injury, may be a result of the effect that the brain injury had on the breathing, or it may be a bit of both. But one thing that we do know, and I've first-hand experience of this and worked with clients that have improved, by clients that have had brain injuries and concussions, by working on their breathing, by working on simple things to restore the body's relationship with carbon dioxide, to improve their mechanics of breathing, and to reduce their respiratory rate, which will all have an impact also on our nervous system and the state of stress. After a trauma like a brain injury, the body is going to be in a state of fight or flight, a state of stress, a state of inflammation. And there's things that we can do, need to do, should do in order to improve that, as well as using those things as markers to be able to assess how much recovery has taken place for the brain, rather than just assessing people's symptoms. One thing that's linked to breathing is heart rate variability, and that is an indicator of autonomic nervous system function, and an indicator, we can use that as an indicator, a very good indicator of stress resilience and how much stress the body and the system is under. There are tools, literally devices that will measure heart rate variability, give us an output, and we can use this biofeedback to actually make an assessment of someone's nervous system, and we can then use breathing to positively influence their HRV and be able to actually influence their nervous system. I'm very excited to, I will be having, we haven't recorded it yet, but I have a guest, Dr. Jay Wells, who's an expert in heart rate variability. So Dr. Jay Wells is going to be coming on the podcast as a guest to talk about this. I've had a few meetings with him. One really interesting bit that I'll share with you now, because it's relevant to this, is that he's seen within the literature that on average, post-concussion, it can take about 3 to 4 months, he was saying, that before heart rate variability starts to normalize. So we've seen in the literature on brain injuries, concussions, that symptom-free after 7 days. You could still have issues around your brain if you had an MRI scan after 7 months, or potentially even years. But the literature is showing us that we probably haven't done longer studies on that. I have one of NIS1 being me over a scan on 6 months after my injury, and then one 10 years after my injury, and I will share those results with you. But I want to keep this episode a little bit broad on like what the literature out there is saying to us. So we can use both breathing and HRV to give us some markers, some baseline to be able to utilize and assess people's breathing, assess people's stress response after a concussion, rather than just relying on whether someone's symptom-free. Because the reality is, we're not going to be able to do a functional MRI scan on everybody every sort of week trying to track their progress, because one, you wouldn't want to give someone that much radiation through having the scans, and two, it's not, well, that's the main thing, and it's not cost effective, but it's just not going to, it's not a plausible way to do it. You're going to cause probably more harm than good if you're going to scan someone's brain 10 times before they get back to playing their sport or whatever it may be. So we need to look at better solutions than just assessing symptoms, and the literature is pointing towards breathing as well as HRV as tools that we can use to assess people's brains' recovery post concussion or post injury. And then the really nice side of flipping the coin on it, not only helping to assess how they're recovering, they can be tools to help us improve our cerebral blood flow, improve our oxygen supply to the brain, improve the down regulation of the nervous system, improve the heart rate variability, and restore good functional breathing patterns, which will help the brain recover more effectively and more efficiently. I've seen it with myself, and I've seen it with clients that I work with, and I'm sure that the more we get this message out there, and the more people that we get to work with, we're only going to see that being more and more the case. Now, one of my final statements, I guess, about this might seem a little bit alarming, but it is literally the truth, that second impact syndrome is a real thing. The more a brain is not fully recovered, the more likely it is to sustain a worse brain injury. That's what I personally experienced. And second impact syndrome, if it's in very close proximity to each other, the worst case scenario is that people can die. People have died on sports fields from this, and the very sad thing is it's highly likely that it's going to happen again, and that is, I feel horrendous saying it, but it's just a truth. We need to do something about this, and that's what this whole piece and this whole research for me into this is about: finding solutions, working with people, helping with people, and being able to allow people to make informed choices about whether they continue with their particular sport or exercise or thing that they're doing, activity they're doing, as well as giving them tools so we don't feel helpless during that recovery period. So tools to help you actually recover better, and tools to be able to assess your brain's recovery better too. So I hope this has been an insightful starting point, part one for us. I'm going to leave you with a little bit of advice if you are suffering with a concussion, a couple of little things that you can do immediately to help you. I wanted to point to the literature. This isn't just my ideas. I wanted to point to the literature that people have been researching, show you that it dates back for centuries. It dates back for decades, back to the 1960s, and then we've got really current stuff coming out as well. And it makes me feel it's a bit of an old program, but anyone remember X-Files? My Mrs. Jacko's got a bleeding. She had a crush. She probably still does, but she had a crush on Mulder from X-Files. And I was like, Mulder from X-Files. I suppose I was like, okay, that's okay. I guess you can have a crush on him, because I don't feel like it. I was, worried it was going to be someone maybe better looking. Anyway, it does feel a little bit like, Mulder's thing was like, the truth is out there. I think that's what I want to. It almost feels a little bit like that. It's like the literature is out there. The information has been done. I just want to try and help. One, spread the message and spread the awareness, and two, piece together the bits of better ways to assess our breathing assess our brain's recovery with breathing and with heart rate variability. We'll have protocols to be able to help people with that process. It's an ongoing process. I have been some very successful results with some clients that I've had that have suffered with concussion. So if you are suffering with concussion, brain injuries, even if it is like the latest person I worked with, their concussion was 18 months ago, and we made some significant changes in just 3 or 4 weeks. It was about 5 or 6 weeks. Even though the incident was 18 months ago, the symptoms were lasting a long time, and there was something that we could do and address. For myself, it's been a 10-year process. And there'll be, and there's everything in between. So do get in contact. All the details will be in the show notes. My email is info@probreathwork.com. I will put links into the studies that I've referenced, because I'm sure some of you will want to go and see those firsthand. So they will be referenced in the show notes. I'm going to be putting together a whole blog series on this as well, that will highlight and actually give protocols at the end of them as we get through this work. And I want to be able to put on some webinars or seminars, or if there's someone you're part of a governing body, or you're part of a sports team, and you'd like I've got a presentation that I'm developing to be able to deliver this to potentially staff and potentially also the players or the athletes as an educational workshop. So that will all be available too. So if you are interested, get in touch via info@probreathwork.com. I'd love to know what you think of the information that we've put out there in this first episode. And the final thing is to leave you a little bit with something that you can do if you or someone you know or love or you're looking after has been suffering with a brain injury or concussion. So one of the most simple things that we can do, because it has so much of an effect on our breathing rate and will help us work on our carbon dioxide sensitivity, and also helps to change brain states, is choosing to breathe through the nose as often as you can. Now, it's likely if you've had a concussion or brain injury that depending on how long it's gone on for, your altered breathing patterns, breathing rate and CO2 sensitivity may have put you in a place where your nose feels quite blocked, and it's more common and feels more natural to breathe through your mouth. And the starting point for us is to try to keep the mouth closed, be aware and conscious of your breathing, and to breathe through the nose, and try and breathe more gently, try and breathe a little bit more quietly, because that allows you to breathe a little bit slower. And you go, gosh, is that is the starting point. Okay, so being aware, there's more stuff I'll put in place in terms of how we can actually really improve cerebral blood flow with some short little breath holds, as well as things around breathing mechanics. But as a starting point, if I just knew that, if I had one thing, I was thinking, what do I want someone to go with at the end of this podcast? If this was me back in 2013 listening to this podcast, what would I want to say to me? And I'd say, Jacko, just try to spend some time relaxing into your body with your mouth closed, trying to breathe gently and trying to breathe quietly, because that's going to help to bring the heart rate down. It's going to help to bring the nervous system down. It's going to change brain states. Nasal breathing compared to mouth breathing has been shown to do that, and it's going to reduce the respiratory rate, and it's going to just allow the body to recalibrate its relationship with carbon dioxide, and it's just the starting point for working on our breathing. I say I'll go into more detail as this series unfolds, but as a starting point, that is going to be, I mean, even if you haven't had a brain injury, that's going to be something that's going to be nice for you to do. Ideally, feeling a little sense of air hunger. And what does air hunger mean? Just the feeling that you'd like to take a slightly bigger breath when you do just gently slow those nasal breaths down. Now, that sensation, understand that sensation of air hunger is just carbon dioxide building up. And remember, after post brain injury, post concussion, you've probably become more sensitive to carbon dioxide. So when you feel that urge to breathe, it's not that oxygen's low, but buy yourself a pulse oximeter and put it on your finger, and you'll see you'll be at 98, 99%. You're almost full. The urge to breathe is not coming from oxygen at all. It's coming from carbon dioxide levels just rising a bit. And all that's happened is we've become sensitive to it through the brain injury itself. And so one of the things is just to gently recalibrate our brain's relationship with that carbon dioxide building up. So feeling just a very light sense of air hunger, and just sitting with it and just relaxing into it. Don't make it stressful, but just sit and relax into it. We're changing on a psychological side that psychological relationship with that feeling of air hunger and feeling of wanting to take a bigger breath and that breathing stimulus, and helping the brain's chemoreceptors recalibrate what is an acceptable level of carbon dioxide. Because when you get more comfortable with that carbon dioxide, that's going to help with that cerebral blood flow. That's going to help with that oxygen delivery to your brain. That's going to be the thing that's going to help your brain the most recover from your injury. So I hope that helps. If you want some exercises to literally follow, if you head over to probreathwork.com on the Foundations of Breathing course, which is completely free, there are recordings and exercises to follow along to help you with that slower down regulation nasal breathing pattern. So you head over to probreathwork.com and check out the free Foundations of Breathing course. I'll put a link in the show notes for that as well. So wow, there we have it. I said it was going to be a big one. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't too heavy. I hope that the science makes sense and is rational. I'm trying to make it easy for us all to understand. And yeah, thank you so much for the support of the podcast. Like, we've only, I think as I record this, I've released like 3, and the response has been absolutely amazing. So please do keep sharing it. Please do keep subscribing, whether you want to do on Spotify or Apple or Android, or whether you want to watch it. The video is also on YouTube. I really appreciate your support in subscribing so you get notified of when more will come. And I also massively appreciate the positive feedback you've given, people recommending guests. Keep doing that as well, and sharing, particularly this one. If there is someone that you know that's playing a contact sport, if there is someone that you know that is involved or has had concussions or brain injuries, please do share it with them. I hope it's helpful, and I look forward to sharing more in part 2 that will be coming up for you very soon. So I'll finish always, as ever, by saying you've been breathing, I guess, and listening. I've been Jacko. Until next time, keep it nasal.